Welcome back to Rules of Engagement. This is the introduction to the StarCraft 2 and the different races portion. We just went over about how Terran and Protoss are. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how the Zerg race are. These little insect guys that crawl across the map. If you're someone who doesn't mind spiders in your house, then this is the race for you to play. They're they're cute in their own way, let's put it that way. But let's actually get into a replay, take a look at some of these Zerg units, and talk a little bit about them. So, similar to how Terran and Protoss work, of course, Zerg is going to mine minerals in roughly the same manner. You're going to have your workers. They're going to constantly mine for you, do their own thing. They're all working off of that hatchery and mining you the resources you need to build other buildings. But a couple of different things is the building difference. So unlike Terran and Protoss, where let's say your basic building, your barracks, your gateway, those all are going to end up building stuff for you. The Zerg buildings, they don't even, you just build them and it unlocks a new unit you can get from your hatchery. So your initial starting building actually builds every single unit in the game. You do it by these larvae. So you can grab these larvae, and you can see all the different units you can turn it into. And we'll talk about a little more about the cool things of larvae later in the game, or later in the show, excuse me. But we're going to talk a few more things about the way buildings work. So one of the cool things, another thing about Zerg, is they have to place their buildings on creep. So if you notice, most of the map has a certain terrain. It's grass or it's dirt, etc. But the Zerg just covers it with this brown sludge, right? That's just what Zergs do. They can only construct new buildings, except for, there's a couple of buildings they can build off creep, but in general, they have to build their buildings on the creep, on the sludge here. So, if you grab your drone, you tell it, let's say, to build a spawning pool. Oops, the wrong button there. Grab a drone, tell it to build a spawning pool. You can notice, okay, well, it's not letting me hit the thing. But you'll notice you can build them on creep, but you cannot construct them off creep. So you can say, how do I spread more creep around? So there's a unit called a Zerg Queen, and this queen can drop these creep tumors, which then spread creep around. So there's creep going all over the edge of the map. It's kind of spreading just about everywhere. And it does a couple things. One is it lets you place down buildings. The other thing it does is it actually makes your unit faster. So we can click on this roach, right? It's a basic Zerg unit. We can look at its speed. It says 2.22 plus 0.67. What that means is the roach normally moves at speed 2.25. But because it's on creep right now, we can see the roach is right here. So it's on creep right now. Its movement speed gets an additional 30% boost. It moves up to additional 0.67. So creep makes all your units move faster as well. It's very, very, very important to the Zerg arsenal. Now back about the buildings. Not only do you have to build them on creep, but the way that they unlock buildings is a little bit unique. So for the Terran, for example, you have to build the barracks, then you can build the tech labs and the factories. The Protoss have to start with a gateway, then you can advance up your tech structure. The Zerg, what unlocks buildings is their main hatchery transforms. It morphs into a new form. So if you can, at the start of the game, you can build a spawning pool and then later a roach warren. But then to progress past that, you have to turn your hatchery into a lair, right? You mutate into a lair, which costs additional resources. Once it's at this lair form, you can see it looks a little bit different, right? It's getting bigger, it's looking more aggressive and dangerous. It unlocks more buildings. It unlocks the Hydralisk Den, the Infestation Pit, the Spire, and these buildings in turn unlock the ability to turn your larva into a greater variety of units, some more advanced units from the Zerg. And then eventually you can turn this lair into a hive. And then once you get this hive, it looks even more kind of larger and intimidating. The spines on the sides get bigger. And this hive unlocks the buildings, the Greater Spire, and the Altiris Cavern. And these in turn unlock the ultimate Zerg weapons, their late game units. We'll talk about those at the end of the show. But the Zerg way works is you evolve your race by transforming your key core building into a more advanced form. So now we're going to talk about the production things. I mentioned that these larvae are what's used to produce everything. And you just unlock the ability to turn them into more and more advanced units as you build more buildings. The really cool thing about this, the strategic implication of having this ability, is that you can choose to turn larvae into either harvesters or units. So if you think about it this way, with your Terran or your Protoss, your basic starting building can only build harvesters, which means you're capped at a harvester production rate of however fast that building can produce them. And then you have your barracks that can only produce military units. So you have a certain amount of buildings that can produce harvesters and a certain amount that can produce military units. The Zerg, they can always choose to turn all their larvae into harvesters, all of them into military units, or some range in between, which allows them to really do extreme bursts of economic growth and also extreme bursts of military growth, which is a really, really cool aspect about the Zerg. And now we're going to talk about some of the general units of the Zerg arsenal. So over here we have the basic Zerg units. You have the Zergling, very, very, very small, cheap, and fast. We'll talk a little bit more about their strengths in a bit. And then we also have the Roach. It's kind of a little bit stronger, a little bit sturdy. You can see the basic appeal of those Zerg units, though. They all look kind of insect-like. They look a little bit kind of creepy. They're like the aliens from the Alien vs. Predator movie. They're like the roaches that you see in your garage or something like that. Some of them have a little bit more cute look to them, though. Like the Altiris is kind of a cool guy. We'll talk more about him later. I personally like the Zerglings. These little guys are kind of cute and fluffy, so sharp edges, though. They're kind of like house cats, right? They look kind of cute and cuddly, and then they'll probably rend you with talons if you step a little bit too close. So let's talk a little about the Zerglings, your basic Zerg unit. So they're not as versatile as those the Terran Marines, right? They don't have that advantage. And they're not as tough to kill as the Protoss Zealots are. But what they do have is they move very fast. If you can look at their base movement speed, even off creep, as soon as you get a speed upgrade, they can move at 4.7. That's very, very, very fast. The fastest unit in the entire game of StarCraft is a Zergling. The other advantage they have is they're very cheap. So you can get a swarm of them up very easily. And of course, once you have the swarm, you can quickly overwhelm your opponent, surround them from all sides, and tear them to pieces. And this can work against the Terran Marines. It can also work against the Protoss Zealots. So anytime you're in an open area, an open environment, Zerglings are great because you can get that surround, you can swarm down units. Of course, you have to watch out for units that do splash damage because they'll take out multiple Zerglings per hit, but they're fairly effective in an open environment against anything without splash damage as long as they can get that key surround. So they're kind of the core general unit of the Zerg arsenal. Let's take a step back and talk about some of the cool late game units that Zerg can get. I already mentioned it briefly. One of them is being the Altiris. Let's take a look at him. The Altiris has a couple really cool strengths. Beyond having a Santa hat, that's a pretty cool strength as well. But he's fast moving. He's not as fast as Zerglings, but for a late game unit, most late game units are fairly slow moving. The Altiris is the fastest moving late game unit in the game. That's a lot of games saying, but for those big strong units, he moves pretty fast. Another strength is he has a ton of damage that's specifically designed to deal against armored units. So against big units, against other big units, he can tear them apart very fast, and he also does splash damage to ground targets. So very, very effective against certain types of ground targets. He can cleave through them with those giant claws he has at his front. Another strength is he has a ton of life. Not quite as much as the battlecruiser, but it's his second, pretty much the second highest in the game. And he has the ability to unlock an armor upgrade that gives him additional armor. So he's very, very tough to kill. A couple of his vulnerabilities, though, is that he has no range on his attack. So he has to get up close to units to do damage. So if your opponent has a ton of different range damage units, you have to find a way to get him into range fast before he takes too much damage. Another vulnerability is he can only attack ground units. So, of course, if they have a bunch of airships, don't make too many of these guys. They'll run around in a circle and look pretty while they're all getting rained down upon fire from above. So you got to watch out against air units with these guys. The way to maximize their use is, of course, we're going to prioritize armor upgrades. The reason why we do that is because I mentioned they have to get close to their opponents to really get in there and do their damage. And they can only get close if they can survive. So try to get those armor upgrades, especially they have a special upgrade in that Altiris Cavern. Gives them additional bonus armor. Make sure to get those upgrades if you're using Altiris. Another key way to use them is you can combine them with Queens and Infestors. Those are two other Zerg units that when you play the game you can experiment a bit with. The key ways they combine well with Altiris is the Queens have a heal ability. So we talked about the Altiris needs to get up close. Trying to get up close will be taking damage. The Queens can try to keep healing him to keep him alive in order to cover that distance. And the Infestors have an ability that can prevent your opponent from moving. There's nothing more frustrating in the game than when your Altiris charges an enemy line, he finally gets close, and then they run away. And he still can't attack him. So it's really great to pair him with that Infestor, so once he does get close to enemy units, the Infestor can lock him down, make him stay where they're at, and so they have to sit there and take the Altiris blows. Now we're getting on to the other Zerg late game unit. That's going to be the Broodlord. So the Broodlord is one of the ones that if you watch Pro StarCraft, a lot of people say this guy is very, very scary. So One of the reasons why he's scary, his key strength is he has a long-range anti-ground attack. He only hits ground again, so a little bit of vulnerability, but he has a long-range anti-ground attack that every attack he shoots spawns additional troops to fight for you. Every time he attacks, all of a sudden your opponent has more units to deal with. And that's going to soak up some of the damage that was intended for your more important units. And those little units also fight as well, so it's almost doing double damage. The Brood Lord attack, plus those little guys on the ground that he kind of summons with every little attack, they'll be quite annoying too. A couple of vulnerabilities of the Brood Lord is one, he doesn't have very much life. If you notice that, he's pretty vulnerable, so you've got to keep him safe. His other vulnerability is he can't fight air units, so, if they have a lot of air army, you got to have him protected from the ground. You got to be careful with that. He's also very slow moving, so you have to be really careful because he's vulnerable, he has low life, he can't fight back against air, and he's slow. So be a little bit careful when you use these guys. They can die pretty quick if you don't take great care of them. So now we need to talk about how to maximize the use of this Brood Lord. As we mentioned, there's a couple key vulnerabilities of it, but to maximize the use, one, you can pair him with Infestors. Just like the Infestors can lock down units to allow the Ultralisk to close with them, the Infestor can also lock down units to prevent those units from closing with the Brood Lord. So Infestors are very key in your late game Zerg arsenal, regardless of which late game Zerg units you use. The other thing that you want to do is you want to pair them with Corruptors. We mentioned how the Brood Lord can't attack air units. Corruptor is the primary Zerg anti-air fighter. So you get a bunch of those, and they can deal with the air. Your Brood Lords can deal with the ground. It's a great combination. Then the last thing is you want to get a pack of them because they're slow-moving and vulnerable. They work best in large numbers. So I hope you guys enjoyed this briefing of the Zerg race. This is going to be it for this show, but I'll see you guys again tomorrow at 5 Eastern for Mechanics of the Bazaar.